So following on from thermoregulation and osmoregulation, we're now going to have a look at gas regulation. So to get us started, there are two really important gases that form a part of our cellular respiration process. Obviously, when we eat sugar and we breathe in oxygen, we use this to create ATP or energy, and a byproduct of this is our other gas, carbon dioxide. So we're taking in oxygen, we're removing carbon dioxide. And so these two gases become really important in terms of their concentration within the body as they're exchanged at the alveoli. Now, if we change our breathing rate, so how quickly we're taking breaths in and out, it's obviously going to change the amount of oxygen in and the amount of carbon dioxide out. Finally, we need to obviously recognise that the circulatory system is what is going to regulate that oxygen moving away from the lungs and out to body cells, such as the cells right in the tips of your pinky toe, and also taking carbon dioxide away from those same cells to the lungs to get rid of it. So, when we talk about the concentrations of gases, the most important gas in your body, funnily enough, is carbon dioxide, in terms of controlling how quickly and how deeply you breathe. Now, carbon dioxide is found in a couple of different ways, but what it does do is it's dissolved in blood plasma commonly, and what it'll affect is something else which becomes very important, is the concentration of hydrogen ions. So when carbon dioxide dissolves in water, so aka blood plasma, it forms carbonic acid, and when this breaks down, it forms both hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. So we've got a few options here. First of all, again, we start with carbon dioxide and water, which can form carbonic acid nice and easily. Carbonic acid breaks down readily, forming hydrogen ions. Keep highlighting that in green to make it distinct, and bicarbonate ions as well. So before we come back to our feedback loops and the concentration of these three things, so oxygen gas, carbon dioxide gas, and hydrogen ions, we're going to have a look at how breathing is controlled in the body. So there are two really important nerves that we need to know about. I'm going to use some interesting colours here. So we'll start with the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve is this nerve which runs all the way down, I'm highlighting it in green now, from the medulla oblongata, from our expiratory centre, and it stimulates the diaphragm, so this muscle that I'm highlighting in green now. Now, the second nerve are the intercostal nerves. And these intercostal nerves, again, I'm going to highlight them in blue for you now. They run all the way through the spinal cord, down, and to the muscles in between the lungs, so the intercostal muscles. Now, as we're aware, breathing can be voluntary or involuntary. And unfortunately, it's probably going to be voluntary now that you're thinking about it. But these two centres are quite different. So when we're talking about voluntary versus involuntary breathing, the voluntary portion of our brain is the cerebrum. The involuntary portion of our brain, and I'll highlight it on my diagram and over on the left as well, is the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata is what takes over when you're not thinking consciously about your breathing. The final nerve that I've got on this slide that I do want to highlight very briefly, and I'll do so in purple, is the vagus nerve. Now, the vagus nerve runs from the lungs up to the respiratory centre, and it tells the respiratory centre if the lungs have stretched and if they are expanding. So, we've got two different options here. Number one, we're going to start with inhalation. So when we inhale, an impulse is sent to the diaphragm from the inspiratory nucleus, or the inspiratory portion of the medulla oblongata, and an impulse is also sent to the external intercostal muscles. And this tells these muscles, both the diaphragm and the external intercostals, to contract and to allow the lungs to expand due to that changing pressure. In terms of the expiratory, the expiratory centre of the medulla oblongata, we send an impulse purely to the internal intercostal muscles. So internal versus external. Now you'll notice that the eyes and ears switch here, and it's quite unfortunate. However, this is an important thing to mention in your extended responses. So back to our three main important gases and ions. So when we talk about stimuluses and the triggering of this inhalation and exhalation, there are two really important ones and one that is less important. So the two really important things for us are firstly the concentration of carbon dioxide and secondly the concentration of hydrogen ions. The one that has much less of an effect than the other two is the concentration of oxygen gas. So your breathing and your desire to breathe is much more heavily regulated by the concentration of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions than it is with oxygen. So when we're talking about these receptors, I'll try and highlight these as best I can here. We have central chemoreceptors, which, as we've previously mentioned, were up in the medulla oblongata. I did that in pink earlier, sorry, I'll keep it consistent. So the medulla oblongata, apologies, a little typo in there as well. So we're talking about the medulla oblongata containing all of the central chemoreceptors. We also have chemoreceptors found outside the body or inside the body but outside of that brain, and they are the peripheral chemoreceptors. And they're found in a spot, or two different spots, known as the aortic and the carotid bodies. So the aortic bodies stem from the aorta and from the subclavian artery. Okay, so this portion of the aorta up here. And the carotid bodies branch off from the carotid artery. So, breathing rate. How is this influenced? Here's our first feedback loop for gas concentration. Number one, our strong stimulus is detected. So either a high concentration of carbon dioxide levels or a high concentration of hydrogen ions. This is detected by chemoreceptors in both the aortic and carotid bodies, so our peripheral, and our chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata, so our central. In this case, the modulator is the respiratory center of the medulla oblongata, and what it does is it sends a motor impulse along autonomic nervous system. The two specific nerves that we're talking about there are those that we highlighted earlier, which were the phrenic and intercostal nerves, and they travel to the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. Okay, so the diaphragm, external intercostal muscles. What they then do is they're going to increase not only the rate of contraction, but also increase, another typo here today, increase the rate and depth of breathing. And this in turn is going to increase the amount of gas that is exchanged, decreasing the carbon dioxide levels and or decreasing the concentration of hydrogen ions. As we jump on down, find a little diagram here. This is just another version showing some of these different structures and what they're involved in. So number one, chemoreceptors and the respiratory center in the medulla oblongata. Secondly, we can also see the vagus nerve and the intercostal nerves and the phrenic nerve. So maybe we'll highlight all of these nerves in a slightly different colour to what we've got everything else going on. And these nerves are also really important. So the main thing for you to note here is going to be each of these structures of this feedback loop. However, in order to understand this, it really comes back to an understanding of where the receptors are located and the role of the particular nerves and how they travel up to the medulla oblongata.